Good morning. So, my brother and many others and I, this on Friday night and Saturday morning, helped out at this homeless breakfast. And the point of it was that we were making a difference little by little, and so this poem goes along with that. A little boy walked carefully along a crowded beach where starfish by the hundreds lay within his reach. They washed up with each little wave as far as the eye could see, and each would surely die if they weren't sent back to sea. So one by one he rescued them, then heard a stranger call. It really won't make it much of a difference, for you cannot save them all. But as he tossed yet another one toward the ocean's setting sun, he said with deep compassion, I made a difference to that one.
A reading from the Gospel according to Matthew chapter 22, verses 1 through 14. Jesus responded by speaking again in parables.
The kingdom of heaven is like a king who prepared a wedding party for his son.
He sent his servants to call those invited to the wedding party.
But they didn't want to come.
Again, he sent out other servants and said to them,
Tell those who have been invited, look, the meal is prepared. I've butchered the oxen and the fattened cattle. Now everything's ready. Come to the wedding party.
But they paid no attention.
They paid no attention.
They paid no attention and went away, some to the fields, others to their businesses.
The rest of them grabbed his servants, abused them, and killed them.
The king was enraged.
He sent his soldiers to destroy those murderers and set their city on fire. Then he said to his servants,
The wedding party's prepared, but those who were invited weren't worthy. So go to the roads on the edge of town and invite everyone you find to the wedding party.
Then those servants went to the roads and gathered everyone they found, both evil and good. The wedding party was full of guests.
Now when the king came in and saw the guests, he spotted a man who wasn't wearing wedding clothes.
Friend, how did you get in here without wedding clothes?
He was speechless.
Then the king said to his servants,
Tie his hands and feet, throw him out into the furthest darkness. People there will be weeping and grinding their teeth. Many people are invited, but few people are chosen.
Thank you. Stories to tell. One of my favorites was told by Robert Fulghum. He wrote the book, Everything I Needed to Know I Learned When I Was in Kindergarten. And he also wrote another book called It Was on Fire When I Lay Down. And in that book, he tells the story of a mother of the bride. He calls her MOTB. And this mother of the bride was very much a control freak, or at least in this set of circumstances. Maybe she was okay, but she had 7 months to plan her daughter's wedding. And Fulghum says he only spoke to the bride and the groom 3 times, but in that 7 months, he had a call or a visit from the mother of the bride every day. She insisted on hiring an 18-piece brass and wind ensemble because the organ just wouldn't do for her daughter's wedding. She took care of every last detail. Everything was engraved that could be engraved. The bridesmaids' dresses were, of course, custom made to order. But not only that, also the groomsmen's tuxedos were all custom made to order and bought, not rented, bought. She even returned the engagement ring to have a larger diamond put into it. Nothing was left to chance. She had hired 3 videographers for the wedding. Well, of course, the story goes that the day came, everything was perfect. Meanwhile, the bride and her father were back in the reception hall, and she was nervously nibbling on a number of different hors d'oeuvres, and her father gave her a little glass of pink champagne to wash this all down and help calm her nerves. And Fulcrum says, as she walked down the aisle, she looked radiant, except she looked white as a ghost. And she proceeded down the aisle with the 3 video cameras rolling and threw up all over her mother when she got to where her mother was. Which later they all laughed about it, and it was a wonderful ceremony with the groom holding her up once she got cleaned up and everything. But and you could, of course, see every last detail because of the 3 video cameras. My husband Jim married a couple who, also a mother of the bride, refused to come to the wedding. In fact, she called Jim to tell him that she didn't think that he should marry them because the groom had arthritis, and she felt that her daughter was going to end up having to take care of him as he got, they were in their 20s at the time, but that he would become crippled and decrepit and that she'd have to take care of him. And so she divided her whole family. Very few members of the bride's family came to the wedding. She even refused to let the father come to the wedding. And so we were trying to remember this morning, we think an aunt defied her sister and did come to the wedding, and maybe even was the one who gave her away. But, you know, made it a hardship for this young couple starting out. There are all kinds of wedding horror stories, but I don't think any compare to the story that Jimmy and I just read this morning. A king is planning a wedding for his son, and people are invited. Reminders are sent out. There are guests who don't show, so the king sends servants out to remind the guests even again, and a bloodbath ensues. Some ignore the servants' request for them to come, some beat and abuse the servants, and others kill some of the servants. So the king in turn sends his troops in to kill everyone in the village. So the good and the bad and the indifferent end up dying. Then the king insists that others still be invited to the party, so the servants that are left go out into the highways and byways and compel people to come to this wedding, and the good and the evil come to the wedding. The party gets started, and then one of the guests gets tossed out for not having the right clothes into the utter darkness where there is gnashing of teeth, to hell itself. I think this is a very scary story. I want it to be nicer. And I imagine some of you do. I mean, I tell you, I would not want to go to this wedding. I would be searching for a place to hide once it all was going down, and don't even talk to me about what to wear. That's always hard, figuring out what to wear to a wedding. But in this set of circumstances, it's downright scary. So again, like the passage that we had this week, many scholars have traditionally interpreted that the king is God, like they interpreted last week's passage that the landowner was God, and that the groom is Jesus, and then they're putting a big emphasis on the kingdom of heaven is like, that started at the beginning of the passage. Now, there are parallels to this story in the Gospel according to Luke, and also the Gospel of Thomas, which is not a part of our canon, our scriptures, but still is something, you know, we can glean some learnings from. But those parables emphasize the openness of the feast. After their initial invitees are, decline coming, and there's no violence or retribution in their versions of the story. So I had to struggle this week and wonder why we've always assumed that every reference to an authoritative male figure in Jesus' parables is supposed to be God. And any reference to that figure's son is always supposed to be Jesus. And with the parables, is the interpreter supposed to look at them as symbolic and metaphor? About heaven and hell, about, the afterlife. And dare we ask, did even the writer of the parable understand the meaning of the parable? And there's not one meaning of the parable. There's different meanings through the ages. So again, I want to ask, what if the king is not God? Because the king's behavior resembles someone more like North Korea's Kim Jong-un or Russia's Vladimir Putin, or any number of brutal dictators that we can name and think of through the history, including the Herods and the Caesars of Jesus' time. My friend and Jewish biblical scholar, she's actually a Jewish New Testament scholar, which is very interesting, Amy Jill Levine, has said, if this parable doesn't disturb, there is something askew with our moral compass. And again, like last week, I have to wonder if the kingdom or the reign of heaven is like this story. It's just impossible to make sense of it. Is burning down an entire city the way that the reign of God models responding to insults and violence? And what's up with this guy in the wrong clothes? He's not merely asked to leave, but he's bound and hand and foot and thrown into the outer darkness where there is weeping and gnashing of teeth. He would have been better off never to have come to this event. If this is the kingdom of heaven and this is what God is like, how does that compare to what Jesus was teaching in the Sermon on the Mount? It just doesn't match up. So I agree with Amy Jill, or A.J. Levine, when she said it would be better if we perhaps started by seeing the parable not about heaven or hell or final judgment, but about kings, politics, violence, and the absence of justice. If we do, we might be getting closer to Jesus. So I pondered a little bit with, and you could do this with so many different things, with a metaphor that's kind of more current, that's a little dear to my heart. So what if the king represents the leaders in our government right now who want to reduce SNAP benefits? Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. You may have seen the Justice Committee wrote something up about it, and it's on a purple sheet that's downstairs, and I have some copies about it as well too. And it was also in a newsletter article and sent out in an email. They want to require work hours where, for various reasons, the people who are receiving these benefits aren't really able to work the minimum of 20 hours. It may be because there's some place like here where they might not be able to find a 20-hour-a-week job, or it may be that they are not disabled, but they're not that able to sustain working, and a host of other reasons. And like the man without the wedding coat, maybe there are people who, this man was labeled inappropriately dressed. Well, sometimes people are labeling people lazy and poor and just wanting to take care, milk the system. If this rule is implemented, then people who are already vulnerable might be thrown into just abject poverty. They would be cast out into poverty. What if we could be the ones who are hearing this and that we try to address this injustice? Because this actually, this is a proposed change to the requirements for SNAP benefits, and there's an open public commenting session that ends on April 6th. And this paper shows you how to do that. And I actually sent it to all my children, my husband's children, nieces and nephews as well too, asking them to do it, because it only takes about 15 minutes at most to click on a couple of things and put your comments in, and they actually give you a sample comment that you can tweak. But that we could address this injustice. I'm also going to try to send it out in an email, and I posted it to Facebook. So the good, the bad, and the ugly are invited to this wedding banquet, and because of the previous guests who are either dead or didn't come, you know, no one looks good in this story. There's no one to hold up as ideal. I don't think that the king was necessarily an evil person. I think he was someone who had good intentions. It's good intentions to give your son a party, but he just kind of went a little wacko by deciding to send everyone out to, by deciding to send his army out to destroy the village. Because, of course, the innocent died along with the guilty. I just can't see this God as king. Because Jesus came humble and mounted on an ass. Jesus was stripped of his garments in the end. Jesus reveals who God is, full of grace. I can't do the backflips that I think is required to find good news if this king is God. If this is what the kingdom of heaven is like, full of mayhem and murder. I don't want to sign up for that, and I'm not asking you to either. I think we all need to wrestle with this text. I think in the end of my wrestling this week, I came up with more questions than answers. But I want to ask us as I end today, where do you see yourself in this text? Where do you see yourself in the parable? Are you the people who were first invited and got busy or decided you didn't want to come, didn't really like the king, or whatever the reason were? Are you the slaves who are going out and extending the invitation, who get ignored at best, or beaten or killed? Are you the king, trying to control everything going on in your family, or everything going on in your committee, or everything going on at work? Are you the second group of people invited, the good and the evil, depending on the day? Are you wearing the right clothes? Or are you the man who's tossed out for not wearing the right clothes? Out in the darkness, gnashing your teeth and crying. I think that Jesus is asking us to ponder more deeply the ways we welcome people into our doors here. How do we treat those who are dressed or look differently than we are? As I said, I've ended up with more questions than answers, and I hope I've given you something to think about. Amen.